Hi everyone, welcome to Rendering Teardown section. My name's Simon. Today we're going to have a look at this really detailed and interesting food truck rendering. This is going to be a little bit special today because we're instead of focusing on really broad concepts, we're going to really focus on small details because obviously we have like a really high-end rendering here. So first, I'm still going to take a little bit of time to talk about what's really interesting in the image. First thing is, in terms of composition, we have a really simple and straightforward frontal composition, which is interesting. I was wondering at first if the cropping was okay, but I think it's actually it's a really good way to enhance your basically the point of interest of your image by actually putting it right in the middle of the image, which is something you usually avoid when you're dealing with architecture stuff, because it will always look a little bit weird not to have like enough sky or enough context. But in our case here, it's actually a good way to frame the project. We also have a good deal of props in the context that is interesting. We have these tunnels here. We have the sort of out of focus chair here and the tables with a little bit of food on it, so that you sort of really understand quickly what is the food truck about and what it's selling. You also have like the billboard here, so that's a really good thing. In terms of lighting, we also have something quite interesting because we have clearly something coming from the side here that does some really interesting lighting effect on the metal of the truck here, and we also have some softbox coming from the top of the image with that creates this little rim effect here, which is also interesting. And finally, you have all the individual light bulbs here, which is also quite good with a little bit of glow or glare or bloom effect, which is quite interesting. I was kind of wondering if it wasn't a little bit too bright, but I think it's just a matter of taste. A couple of things I want to look at, I think, is it's going to be pretty simple. The first one is going to be regarding the glass here. Second one is going to be regarding the metal, which is already pretty good, but there are a couple of tiny things I think that could make it a little bit better. And also something regarding the dude we have here. So first thing regarding the glass, which is as I said, it's really a small detail, but it's something as you can see, we have a really good amount of detail in each texture, so it would be a shame not to have the same amount of detail in everything. There's a weird reflection happening here, and I'm still wondering what that is, but I think maybe it's something reflected from somewhere we cannot really see. The thing is, if we're dealing with a really, sort of old truck like that, even if it's sort of refurbished, you kind of want your glass to be a little bit sort of vintage. So what I usually do in glass materials is to, instead of just having the refraction and reflection layer, is to have a slight bulge on the edge of the window, basically, and to have a little bit of noise to do a bump map. So basically the idea here is to, instead of having a perfectly flat surface, it's to have a slight recess at the edge of the window. So basically it's using a bump map with a fall off that sort of creates a little recess at the edge, and also add a noise map that is large enough so that you basically, instead of having a perfectly flat reflection, you have like a slight bump in it. This is something really usual even nowadays with like you can see it on skyscrapers and stuff like that, when you have, well, there's two ways. It's either you have like actually expensive panel of glass, but they're extremely large, so they can't be perfectly flat, or you have cheap glass of a small area, but since it's cheap, you also can't really have it perfectly flat. So that means that your reflection is going to be a little bit different, and it means that instead of having perfectly like a mirror-like reflection, you're going to have slight changes in it, which could be really interesting, I think, considering the fact that the idea is sort of have this sort of vintage or retro look. I think it could add something. Also, in the same way that you do have some imperfection on the metal, it could be interesting to add a tiny bit of like not dirt necessarily, but I mean like using dirt maps to have some slight changes in refraction and reflection, so that this is not a perfect glass, because it's really complicated to get that. Be careful though, but that's a good thing, is that the distance we have here is like quite close from the object, so we can put a good deal of details. Would be different if we were sitting like way further from this kind of thing, because we wouldn't even be able to see the details I'm talking about. Second thing, it's really weird. Second thing I wanted to talk about is still regarding the dirt thing. I really like how the metal is looking. I mean, the reflection here and the way it sort of behaves is extremely interesting. I'm just wondering if it couldn't be like, when you use dirt maps, you kind of like, you can use some that is like on the overall objects, but you also have to use some different dirt maps that are in really specific areas in your image, because basically on a car, the ones near the wheels is going to be less like more worn out, and you're going to have like maybe the dirt from the ground that is going to splash in this area and things like that. So in the same way, like this area here could be a little less clean. So it's this kind of detail that could be interesting, I think. Also, since we can see here that I quite like this detail of having like the footpath of some sort of dirt or something, sort of thinks that maybe out of this garage, the soil is not really clean. So that means that maybe the wheels here should be a little bit like this, and maybe the dirt could have been splashed on the underside of this part of the vehicle or something like that. It's really tiny details, but I think when you see this sort of thing, you kind of wonder why this is so clean if the area is not that clean in the end. Two last things I want to talk about, and I think I'll be done. I know that the cutout here has been added as a billboard in the image, in the 3D model directly, and the problem with a billboard is that with complicated lighting, it actually doesn't really behave realistically, because you can see here like basically this guy has many light bulbs above his head, so that means that there are shadows cast on the top of his head and on the top of his shoulder. Whereas here, in our case, if we were looking sideways, you could see that we have the lamp here that is casting shadows, and the guy is here leaning on the bar. The thing is, this is a flat surface, so instead of having the light coming from that side and the light coming from above, the light coming from above is directly stopped at the back of the billboard. So basically what I'm suggesting is that instead, well, you can have like this as a base, but the thing is you're still gonna have to insert it, like to redo the lighting a little bit. So that would mean I cannot really do it because it's too dark here, but basically it would be taking this this thing here and add a little bit of ream effect here and redo the lighting a little bit more properly. So of course it doesn't look good like that, but it's just so that you get the idea of how the light would actually behave. But I think, I'm not sure, like, I quite like the idea actually of having someone in here, but I'm not sure it's really necessary, but still I quite like it. It's just that this there's would be light here on the top of his head, and that is sort of what shows that it's the only not 3D thing in the, well, not fully 3D rendered in the image. The final thing I wanted to talk about is extremely simple and subtle. Oh, there was like is the saturation. I'm usually, like, as you can see, the image itself is not really saturated and is homogeneously saturated, which is, well, it's not a problem, but I feel like when I see it, it's a little bit too desaturated. I usually really like desaturated image, and I tend to desaturate mine a little bit too much. But having a look at this one for a little bit too long, actually, I noticed that it would be like the problem I see in terms of lighting is that the colors are a little bit too dull, because in the end what you have in terms of colors here is just this blue and the orange, but the thing is the blue is not really visible because of the desaturation. So what I was thinking would be to actually add a little bit of a saturation just coming from the outside here. So basically you would have your saturation bumped up a little bit in for the lighting here, so that it gets a little bit warmer, and also to have a little bit of the blue coming from the natural lighting outside. This way you could have like a interesting blue light on the truck here, something getting a little bit desaturated on the side. So this is a slight change, but I think it's quite interesting in terms of complexity in the lighting. Beside that, of course, well, I can't really see anything much to add. It's just like tiny details. They were the same, like I was wondering the same about the wheels here that are a little bit too clean in my opinion, and even the metal part here is maybe like could be a little bit worn out a little bit more. But beside that, it's really is a quite impressive project with a lot of details that is really interesting. These guys were a little bit too repetitive in my mind, but I think it's okay, since it's like standard like jars or something like that. So yeah, really great work here. Just like the tiny details I explained that I think we're still gonna add a little bit of depth in the image. And I think that'll be it. So hopefully you learned some really small but interesting tips for the lighting and detailing of textures, and I'll see you in the next Teardown. Thanks guys, bye.
Tonight.